very proud and happy to welcome Tom Segev on behalf of the Center for Israel Studies. He is, of course, known, I think, to all of you here as the author of many books on Israeli history and related topics, I would say. Tom Segev started his studies of history in Israel at the Hebrew University. He got his PhD at Boston University. And I think one of the reasons we really like his book so much is that he knows how to write. And as a history professor myself, I would say it is because he's not just a historian, but also a journalist, one of the best-known journalists in Israel, who has worked in the 1970s first for Ma'ariv as a correspondent in Germany, and later, until today, of course, is connected with Haaretz. But he's also written on so many aspects of the history of Israel and the pre-state history of Israel as well. I just would like to mention the books on 1949, the first Israelis, the book on 1967, in a way the second founding of the State of Israel, and maybe his best known and perhaps also most controversial book, The Seventh Million, a book which was written in a time when the so-called new historians, as they were called, I don't know if you call yourself one, were established in Israel, and it deals with with the pre-state, yeshuvs, dealing with especially political government towards the Holocaust, and was also critical about the way the political leadership of the yeshuv did or did not deal with regard to the victims of the Holocaust. The last book he wrote before this one was another biography, a biography this time not of an Israeli, but of somebody who, of course, had impact also on Israeli history, Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter. And now, today, the book we will discuss is a biography of the founder and first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, A State at Any Cost, the title, which also tells something. And without much further ado, I think I will pass on to Tom Segev, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Tom Segev here in Washington.
Thank you very much. I hope this microphone is good enough.
I have somebody coming just to double check it's down, but let's.
Okay.
This is the mic.
Okay, I'll try to speak loudly, and hopefully you will all hear me.
Maybe you can use that.
People are asking me today why I am talking about Ben-Gurion instead of talking about Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, in preparing this meeting tonight, I had the feeling sometimes that Netanyahu is stealing the show not only from me, but also from Ben-Gurion. In July, the election campaign was still going on. Netanyahu arranged a little celebration for himself. On that day, July 21st, he was 1 day longer in office than Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion was the longest Israeli prime minister in office, and Netanyahu celebrated that. Now, it is, of course, possible that this was the last happy occasion in his political career, but it was very important to him, because the longer Netanyahu was in office, the more popular Ben-Gurion became in Israel. It's very curious. During the 6 years I spent writing this book, I noticed that not a day passes without Ben-Gurion being mentioned in one of the Israeli newspapers. 4 other biographies were written while I was writing mine. And a very popular movie was made on Ben-Gurion, based on an interview, face-to-face interview with him. So imagine people ordering a babysitter, going out, looking for parking, buying a ticket, all for an interview with a politician. This is curious, and I tried to understand why this is, and I thought that perhaps the longer people follow Bibi's politics, the more they come to appreciate BG's statesmanship and vision and integrity. Now, there were some good reasons to support Netanyahu, but I don't really know anyone who associates him with integrity and statesmanship and vision. Although there is today a generation of Israelis to whom the term prime minister is identical with the name Netanyahu, just as for people of my age who grew up under Ben-Gurion. The whole early life is associated somehow with Ben-Gurion. About 50 years ago, I went with two friends to the kibbutz Sde Boker in the Negev, southern Israeli desert, to interview Ben-Gurion for the student weekly of the Hebrew University. And it was one of the deepest experiences of my life. He looked the way we know him in the pictures, small, stocky, with a huge white lion's mane, and very, very impressive. We were 23, he was almost 83, and I felt that I was sitting face to face with Jewish history itself. We found him in a pensive mood, preoccupied with the past. He spoke to us mainly about the achievements of Zionism. This was at the eve of Israel's 20th anniversary. And he also talked to us about his own life in his hometown, Plonsk, which is about 40 miles north of Warsaw, Poland. I remember a sad man, disappointed and very, very lonely. He talked to us about his wife, Paula, who had died just a few months before. I shall never forget how all of a sudden he almost whispered, "I wanted another child. Paula didn't want to." We were so shocked that he's taking us into the most intimate chambers of his life. He told us something else which we found very surprising at the time. He said that at the age of 3, he knew that he will not remain in Plonsk because even then, as a toddler of 3, he knew that he was an ardent Zionist. And you are smiling because at the age of 23, you were not facing Jewish history, wondering how to continue the conversation. Okay? Is it better? Okay. Okay. Thank you. The tape of that conversation we had with him still exists, and you hear one of us, the most daring one, saying, "Mr. Ben-Gurion, this is something you knew at the age of 3? And he gets very excited and says, yes, of course, at 3, all the children, we were all Zionists, of course. What's the big deal? He was very agitated about it. We felt at the time that it was rather odd that he would say that, and indeed, at that time, he was often no longer fully connected with reality. But in the recent years, when I worked on this biography, it occurred to me that maybe it wasn't that absurd after all. Okay, not 3. But at the age of 13, he already founded a Zionist club in his town, trying to promote the use of the Hebrew language. He and his friends started to speak Hebrew with each other. First, they taught each other, they taught themselves Hebrew, reading, writing, speaking. By the way, writing very nicely. We have letters from that time, and they are in rich, nice Hebrew. And they began to speak Hebrew with each other and hoped to convince all other Jewish people in Plonsk to do the same thing, which was perhaps naive, romantic, a little bit eccentric, just as he was. Because obviously most people of Plonsk spoke Yiddish and Polish, some spoke Russian. They were not Zionists. They did not at all think of moving to Palestine. So Ben-Gurion is a difficult subject for a biography, among other reasons, because very often it's difficult to decide how to relate to things which he did and said. It's difficult to distinguish between vision and fantasy. And Ben-Gurion was a man of both. What's important is that classical Zionism, in the sense of Herzl, classical Zionism was everything to him, beginning at a very early age. It was the core of his personality, the essence of his whole identity. He never had any doubts about Zionism. He never deviated from the central line of Zionism.
Yes.
And when he came to Palestine in 1906, at the age of 20, he brought his Zionist ideology with him. And he tended to understand his Zionist ideology as a modern version of the humanistic teachings of the prophets of the Bible, including peace and freedom and justice. The best definition I can give you for Ben-Gurion Zionism is a Jewish state in Palestine as early as possible at any cost. And more specific, as many Jews as possible, a solid Jewish majority, on as much land as possible, not necessarily the whole country, but as much land as possible, and as few Arabs as possible. And that is something he was able to achieve, and the price was quite high. And in my book, I concentrate on the price, the political price, and also the moral price. This is a somewhat troubling subject. I hope that we have an opportunity to say more about it later. And before you throw a shoe at me or something, let me tell you that at the end of 71 years of its independence, Israel stands for one of the most dramatic success stories of the 20th century. If you compare international statistics, such as the UN, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and others, there are usually about 170 countries on the list, and Israel usually comes among the top 15, which means that most Israelis live better lives than most other people in the world. And they live in a democracy. Most people of the world do not live in democracies. Israel is strong enough to defend itself, and it is a high-tech superpower. And all this is based on infrastructure which Ben-Gurion laid, and therefore you can say that Ben-Gurion's historical contribution is not limited to the fact that he led the struggle for the establishment of Israel, but also for his first years as prime minister and for the foundations which he laid, which made the future development of Israel possible to what it is today. At the same time, we are facing two very big problems which Ben-Gurion himself also faced, and they remain without solution until today. First of all, the life in Israel is life without peace. And the second one is the inability to agree on a common national Israeli Jewish Zionist identity. Ben-Gurion did not believe that it will be possible to reach peace. And most Israelis and most Palestinians today share that view. And he was unable to define the meaning of a Jewish state. He was unable to define who is a Jew. He was unable to define who is an Israeli, who is a Zionist. What does Israeli identity mean? Not that he didn't try. He spent his whole life looking for answers to these questions, but he couldn't find them. And so, until today, our future seems rather bleak. And work on this book led me to the conclusion that we are, in fact, living through an historical experience which has not failed yet, but it has also not succeeded yet. I have a grandson who will be 3 years old next week, and he has not yet told me whether he's a Zionist or not. But I think a lot about him and about his future, and I wonder where in the world will he ever find his happiness. But work on this book also led me, obviously, to deal a lot with questions of power and the solitude of power. I thought a lot about the difficulty to define who is a great leader, and Ben-Gurion offered an answer to that question. And I was not bored even once while working on this book, because I found myself in the company of an amazingly complex character. In recent years, new documents who had been classified before were declassified, including cabinet papers, and they make it possible to reach a deeper understanding, a tridimensional kind of picture of the man who was full of contradictions and conflicts, with a very clear tendency to move very fast and rapidly and suddenly from deep, deep depressions to almost uncontrollable moments of euphoria. And an endless row of irrational outbursts. And the interesting thing is that he was aware of that mental construction, and he very often described it in his diary. The diary, by the way, is an amazingly interesting document. He started writing his diary at the age of 14 and wrote something almost every day until the end of his life. And he wrote in real time while he talked to people. And some people later said that they only saw this part of his head because he's writing all the time. Leading to the question, when did you have time to create a state if you are writing all the time? But he left us millions of written words, and they make it possible to come closer to a man who, until not many years ago, seemed to be carved in stone or cast in steel, standing on a high pillar. So I discovered a man who could also be romantic and poetic, nature lover, his diary is full with very beautiful descriptions of labor, very surprising, of nature. I'm sorry, you wouldn't expect that. Descriptions of sunsets in Palestine, the Niagara Falls, Swiss Alps, very beautiful descriptions. And what I liked most is that he also had a journalistic tendency to describe things that happened to him and deduct the right conclusions from very concrete things that happened to him. And I sometimes felt like a television camera. I'll give you two examples. He had a meeting in 1947, in February of 1947, at the Dorchester Hotel in London. February of 1947 was the coldest February in the history of Great Britain. He reaches the hotel with a meeting with the leader of the Conservative Party, Oliver Stanley, and when he reaches the hotel is unheated. The heating is not on. And he meets Stanley in the lobby. Stanley immediately tells him, "Don't take off your coat." And they sit, both of them, in the lobby, their coats on, discussing whatever they discuss. And Ben-Gurion understands, what does it mean that the British Empire doesn't have enough fuel to heat the most prestigious hotel in Europe, and the most expensive hotel in Europe? The British Empire is obviously sinking. Consequently, they won't stay long in Palestine. The question is, of course, is it true? And that's a question which every biographer constantly has to ask himself. My test for that question is usually, did he have any reason to invent it? Ben-Gurion had no reason to invent such a story, just as he had no reason to invent another story that plays in a hotel in Paris after World War II. He sits in Paris in his hotel. Somebody knocks on the door, a guest from the upper floor. He opens the door, he finds himself facing Ho Chi Minh. He invites him in. Ho Chi Minh talks about his national movement. He talks about his national movement. Ho Chi Minh makes a suggestion. Why don't you, Mr. Ben-Gurion, create a Zionist government in exile with headquarters in Hanoi? The reason that you laugh is why I decided to leave it in. I swear to you that there is not one Ho Chi Minh biographer in the world whom I didn't trouble with the question, have you ever heard anything like that? Nothing. But again, Ben-Gurion doesn't invent. He has no reason to invent such a thing. Also, one of the major problems writing about Ben-Gurion is that he has absolutely no sense of humor. So that makes it a little difficult. Now, some people, especially admirers of Ben-Gurion, tend to forget how deep and how painful some of the controversies were which Ben-Gurion created. And I would just remind those of you, or tell you that the party Ben-Gurion led, Mapai, never received more than 47 seats in the Knesset, which has 120 seats. Meaning that every election, at least 2 or 3 voters did not support Ben-Gurion. So he was very controversial even at the time in almost every sphere of life. Some of them we may be able to discuss tonight. Ben-Gurion and the Arabs, Ben-Gurion and the Holocaust, Ben-Gurion and the conflict between religious and the secular, Ben-Gurion and women, Ben-Gurion and God. We obviously asked him, not for the first time, but for us it was a natural thing to ask. Ben-Gurion, by that time we had already referred to him Ben-Gurion. We spent 3 hours with him. So by that time we just thought, so one of us, not me, one of us asked, Ben-Gurion, do you believe in God? And if we have time, I will tell you what his answer was. So don't run away. When we were there, it was very important to him that we don't describe him as the founder of the state, or the father of the state, or something like that. And indeed, the State of Israel was created as a result of 30 years of the Zionist project. Like other national leaders, Ben-Gurion identified himself with history, and many identified history with him. In almost every situation, he pretended to know what to do. He very much wanted to be a leader and aspired to everything leadership has to offer. The fulfillment of a dream, which in his case was also self-fulfillment, responsibility, power, place in history. And I think that people believed him and believed in him because they were convinced that he believes in himself. In the Zionist movement, there was no other man who studied as systematically and meticulously as Ben-Gurion did the essence of national leadership. What is required of a leader who seeks to reshape the historical destiny of his people. In 1923, Ben-Gurion visited the Soviet Union, and when he came home, he summed up for himself in his diary the essence of the leadership of Lenin. It is a quite extraordinary sentence, one sentence with over 200 words. I cut it a little bit for you. The interesting thing about it is that the terms Bolshevism and the terms communism and also the term Zionism are not included in this sentence, because what he was formulating was a theoretical model of the ideal leader. And this is how he described him. A man who disdains all obstacles, faithful to his goal, who knows no concessions or discounts, the extreme of extremes, who knows how to crawl on his belly in order to reach his goal, a man of iron will who does not spare human life and the blood of innocent children for the sake of the revolution. He is not afraid of rejecting today what he required yesterday and requiring tomorrow what he rejected today. He will not be caught in the net of platitude or in the trap of dogma. His sharp and clear eyes see only the naked reality, the cruel truth, and the actual power relations burning with red flame, the goal of the great revolution. Ben-Gurion wanted to be a Zionist Lenin, sometimes a Zionist Churchill. And I think that no one succeeded to define his leadership better than Ben-Gurion himself. This is what I thought telling you as by way of introduction. Michael?
Thank you, Phil.
Okay, thank you very much.
Let's continue.
Do you have the... Did you get that?
Eventually not. I thought I did, but...
Where's Laura? Laura? Left us.
And where is it?
Okay.
Where's the other one?
You know, it's more important you have it than me, but...
Two handheld.
I thought we put it in.
Okay, we can try these, if you don't mind. We can try. You want to take these? But they don't. Laura? Where's the other one? Okay. So I think what we will do is to expand some of the themes you explored. And in fact, I didn't know what you were going to say, but the one quote I copied from the book was the quote you just read about the leadership. But let me start with the obvious question.
Is that okay? Anybody hears? No. Okay now? No. There is no mic. It doesn't work. Well, I will.
It works. Everybody hears you.
Yeah, it works.
Yes.
You hear? Okay. Fine. Thank you.
So let me start with the obvious question. The question you asked Ben-Gurion, or your fellow reporter from the Hebrew University. I think one of the big questions in the book and in his biography is, of course, his relationship to not just the Jewish people, but to Jewish history, to the Bible, to religion, to God. What did he answer you?
Ben-Gurion was a secular man. He ate pork and he worked on Yom Kippur. Documented. All his life he tried to get an answer to the question, is there such a thing as God? As a young man, he thought the answer is no. He even found some reference, I think in Yeshayahu, Idon and I, we once talked about this, a sentence from which he deducted that God did not choose the Jewish people, but the Jewish people selected God from among other gods. So what is God? Who is God? He had a problem with that. And I'm not sure now if it is 1951 or 1953, he did a very strange thing. He, among other very strange things he did, but he was an official visit to Burma. And following the official part, he stayed longer at the house of the Burmese Ben-Gurion, Unu, the legendary founding father of modern Burma, and he stayed at his house to study Buddhism. He started to study Buddhism from scratch on. He had 3 Buddhist scholars who taught him Buddhism. Why Buddhism? Because he felt that Buddhism is a religion without God. And that is something which he tried to explore. Coming back, he was convinced that he is an expert on Buddhism, and there's a whole cabinet meeting, very long, I think 28 pages or what the minutes of the meeting in which he describes what Buddhism is. And then he wrote a long article in the New York Times about Buddhism. They obviously thought it's a nice story, Ben-Gurion writing about Buddhism. So, but then he went on and had many thoughts about the nature of Judaism and who is a Jew, and could never find an answer to who is a Jew, who is a secular Jew. There's no problem describing a religious Jew for Ben-Gurion, but who is a secular Jew? There was a time in 1957 when a big wave of immigrants came from Poland. Many of them were married to non-Jews, mostly men with non-Jewish women. And the question is how to register the children of these people. And that caused a government crisis, or 2 government crises. And eventually Ben-Gurion tells the cabinet about a guest who had visited him the day before for Shabbat lunch, an American, who tells him, I'm completely atheist. I'm an atheist. And my wife is not even Jewish. And my son, I don't know what he is. So Ben-Gurion asks him, did you have your son circumcised? And the man says, yes. And Ben-Gurion says, why? You're an atheist. Why? What for? And the man says, you know, it's the kind of thing we do for 2,000 years. And so Ben-Gurion was able to report to the government that the chief correspondent of the New York Times, Mr. Sulzberger, is Jewish. But the thing about the circumcision got him to think, and eventually he said he made a suggestion to the government that all these children from newcomers, from mixed marriages, they will be circumcised, and the state of Israel will recognize them as Jews. Said the religious ministers, Mr. Ben-Gurion, you won't find real mohalim. How do you say this in English? I don't know. Okay, you won't find mohalim who will do this for you. He said, if I don't find them, we will introduce state circumcision, and we will bring them to the Hadassah hospital. That's where it will be done. The Israeli cabinet, again, these are 12 or 18 pages where they discuss the nature of circumcision. They are all men. Golda Meir is not present, and not one of them raises the question, okay, but what do we do about girls? Doesn't come up. So I'm telling you, this is a problem which Ben-Gurion didn't know how to solve. He was, and I praise him for that he made a great effort to limit this whole subject into politics. He did not go into theological discussions with rabbis as a rule. Once he did, but that was a mistake. And once he also couldn't hold himself, and in a discussion in government he says to a religious minister, yes, but I'm a different Jew than you. So the search for different Judaism, this is something that constantly preoccupied him. And so when we asked him, Ben-Gurion, do you believe in God? He was already 83. And the older he became, the more he tended to say yes. To us, he said, yes, but I need to tell you what it means. Hallelujah, tell us what it means. So he told us that sometime before that, he had been invited to Sweden, to a town called Uppsala. And in Uppsala, they have a very famous scientific institute, and they showed him a machine that can measure the millionth part of a second. And Ben-Gurion said, they told me that it's not so difficult. There are two wheels. One goes to the right, one goes to the left. You stop the wheels, and you divide the second in millions. Can't be. Millions of a second. I can still hear him say that. A million of a second. There must be a superior power that makes that possible for human beings to reach that kind of scientific genius. Can't be without some superior power. So he said, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that God is an old man with a long beard who sits on a throne and rules the world. I'm saying that there is such a thing as a supernatural superpower. And as I said, he was 83 then, and a few years, I think 1 or 2 years later, he was again asked. For some reason, it's a very thing to do, to ask Ben-Gurion, do you believe in God? And so he just said yes. In later years, he just said yes. So the interesting thing is about the difficulty to define who is a Jew. We have this difficulty until today. But since we are in America, I would tell you that he also had a great difficulty to define who is a Zionist. he knew, for him, Zionism is you all pack your bags and come to live in Israel. If you don't do that, you're not a Zionist. About the same time as he said that he believes in God, he also began to say, I am not a Zionist anymore. Why am I not a Zionist, Ben-Gurion? Because if those Jews in America are Zionists who say that they are Zionists, if this is Zionism, I'm not a Zionist. On the other hand, he knew that Israel cannot exist without a strong Jewish community in America. So that poses an almost theoretical question to Zionism. What are we interested in? That Jews should be weak and come to live in Palestine, or be strong and stay there and help us from the outside? Things which don't really have an answer. And again, this is something he was aware of. This is the interesting thing, that he's a very, very self-aware man, and he has somewhere in his diary a story about a conversation with an American Jewish leader who brags. He says, wow, you won't believe what a house I have outside Chicago, a fantastic house, and I called it Villa Eretz Israel. So Ben-Gurion says, this is very, very nice. I wish you had a fantastic house in Israel and called it Villa Chicago.
That is very telling. I wonder if he knew that Theodore Herzl did not have his son circumcised. He might not have known it or not cared. But it was also a very personal issue for him, because his son married a non-Jewish woman, and then it became a very personal issue. What about his grandchildren? I don't know how much. And then he did also something quite unusual in the 1950s, where he asked over 50 rabbis and spiritual leaders, philosophers around in Israel and around the world, who is a Jew? And of course they couldn't agree. So
the key is what you just said, around the world. Imagine a head of state turning to citizens of other countries, ask them, excuse me, who am I? Who are the Jews? So he got, historically, this is a curiosity. It has absolutely no significance and was basically forgotten. He turned to writers and scholars and rabbis and other intellectuals, most of them outside of Israel, and asked them who is a Jew. He got about 80% of all of them responded that there is no such question, because the Jewish religion determines who is a Jew. A Jew is somebody whose mother is Jewish, and that's my answer to you, Mr. Prime Minister. And but the whole story of how this was orchestrated is also interesting, because there were no long negotiations whom to ask, and there were negotiations with the people. Are you willing to receive such a letter from the Prime Minister of Israel? Will you answer? So it's a whole thing. It made a book. Eventually, you can read all the answers.
Even translated into English.
But there is no solution to the existential, or to this existential problem of Israel.
Well, connected to this, and you talk a little bit about it. When you think of Israel, and you think of Israel's, capital and historical capital, Jerusalem, he didn't care very much for Jerusalem. In that way, he was also like Herzl. Maybe you can say a little bit more about this. It took him 2 years.
Ben-Gurion came to Israel, as I said, in 1906 when he was 20, and he did not visit Jerusalem before 1908. For 2 years, he lived in the land of his fathers, the land of his dreams, and did not care to go to Jerusalem. And when he did, he hated it for a very simple reason. Most people in Jerusalem were either Arabs or Orthodox. The ones and the others anti-Zionist. And so that was not the land of Israel, which for him, land of Israel was Petah Tikva, the Kinneret. For a while, he worked in agriculture, not a very long while, but it was for him so important that in later years he tended to claim that he did that for 3 years. In reality, he did it for 1.5 years. never mind. But this was for him Zionism, and Jerusalem was a problem. I remind you that in 1937, when the British for the first time suggested partition of Palestine, Jerusalem would not have been part of the Jewish state, and Ben-Gurion was for it. And of course, in 1947, the partition plan of 1947, the one that actually led to the creation of Israel, left Jerusalem outside of the Jewish state, and Zionism enthusiastically accepted that. So Zionism had a problem with Jerusalem. In fact, for many years, the capital of Zionism was in Tel Aviv. That's where the politics was, that's where the money was, that's where those Israelis who were identified with Zionism were not in Jerusalem.
One last question about this aspect of the relationship between him and state and the religion. And I think you referred indirectly to what's often called the status quo agreement. So yes. Before the state was founded, and also right after, there were a few agreements between Ben-Gurion as a leader of kind of a secular party and secular state and the religious leaders. And often it is said he agreed to some of the concessions, especially the exemption from military service for the ultra-Orthodox, because he believed they were a marginal group, they would stay a marginal group, and symbolically they're important. Do you think, maybe not willingly, but unwillingly and unconsciously, he thus also contributed to a huge problem Israeli society faces today?
You have to remember that we are now talking about a time when the Orthodox communities in Israel believed that the Zionist secular state is going to persecute them and make it impossible for them to lead their traditional life. So everything the Orthodox do in those days is defensive. It is not a struggle for the future character of the state. It is really in self-defense of their way of living. And for Ben-Gurion, as I said before, it is a political problem. He feared very much that this subject will lead to a cultural war at a time when the Israeli society did not even exist. And so they were still making a society from people who came from this is a cliche, which is actually true. They came from 100 countries and spoke 70 languages, and there was nothing that Ben-Gurion feared more than cultural war. There were also other reasons for it, and he had a very interesting, very calculated, cool attitude. First of all, it is a political problem. Secondly, there are some things which the Orthodox cannot accept. It's not symmetric, the relationship. Some secular people in Israel say, I don't disturb you to go to the synagogue, why do you disturb me to open a supermarket on Shabbat? And Ben-Gurion understands that it doesn't always work like that. An Orthodox man cannot accept that his daughter will be drafted to the army. At the best that can happen, he will leave the country. But he will also go for jail. He will die for it. He will not let his daughter be drafted to the army. So Ben-Gurion understood that there are some things like that which you just have to. Another principle was that the state, as a state, owes certain services to the Orthodox population as citizens with special needs. Synagogues, mikvehs, kosher food, things like that. We just owe them to them. And but the major thing was that the major belief was that you can reach compromises with the Orthodox and the religious. It's possible to live somehow together. These ought to be political compromises. And this is interesting. This is why this is something which a belief which he brought with him from Poland, and I think that he was very much influenced by the relations between less religious and more religious people in his town of Plons. And therefore, the first such compromise was reached in 1920, long before Ben-Gurion was really very prominent, but very shortly after he came. And the problem was the elections to be held for the first parliamentary body, which is the National Assembly or something. Obviously, the Zionist movement was interested in a very wide participation in the elections. The Orthodox in Jerusalem threatened to boycott the elections, and the Orthodox in Jerusalem were a very large part of the population. Makes no sense to have elections if they boycott it. The reason why they boycotted was because they objected to women getting the right to vote. And Ben-Gurion conducted for months, conducted negotiations with leaders of the Orthodox community. He offered this, he offered that, he offered separate voting, polling stations for men and women, whatever. Eventually, the following compromise was reached. Women can vote, they can also be elected, but since presumably Orthodox women won't participate in the election, the vote of every Orthodox man will be counted twice. And that's the way it was done. It's an historical fact. And this is so interesting because it is the first in an endless row of similarly absurd or less absurd compromises. This is what really marks the relationship between religious and non-religious. The Orthodox sometimes it fit Ben-Gurion's political interests. For example, the Orthodox cannot accept, this is one of the things they cannot accept. They cannot accept a state constitution. And we don't have one. Because by accepting a state constitution, they would admit that the constitution we already have, which is the Torah, is a second rate. And so this is the ideological reason why we don't have a constitution. Of course, we also don't have a constitution because Ben-Gurion hated everybody who would say no to him. And so a constitution limits the government. He hated lawyers, by the way. And so this is also why Ben-Gurion insisted that there won't be separation between religion and state in Israel.
Let me ask you a last question before we open up. Of course, a very important question, and let's keep it short here, maybe we'll follow it up. The relationship between Ben-Gurion and the Arab Palestinian population. When he was prime minister, he of course was also prime minister of a minority of non-Jewish Arab Israelis, and even before that was in the coming. And there is also a kind of disputed role he played in the 1948-49 war. Maybe you want to say a few words about his relationship and maybe also if it changed over time to the Arab Palestinians.
Okay, the key word in your question is before, because it all starts very, very early. In 1909, Ben-Gurion, at that time working as an agricultural laborer in a farm called Segev in the Galilee, Arabs attacked the farm, and two of his colleagues were killed, one of them very near proximity to him. And he wrote a letter to his father in which he said, the Arabs, as soon as they see how weak we are, the Arabs are beginning to provoke us. So we need not be weak. This is 1909. 10 years later, Ben-Gurion participated in a discussion in Jaffa about how how to shape the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. What's the proper relationship to the Arabs? And people make all kinds of suggestions. And Ben-Gurion says, everyone sees how difficult the relations between Jews and Arabs are, but not everyone sees that there is no solution to that question. There is no solution. There is an abyss, and nothing can fill that abyss. Two nations are facing off against each other. We want Palestine to be ours as a nation. The Arabs want it to be theirs as a nation. I don't know what Arab would agree that Palestine belongs to the Jews. 1919, 100 years ago. And this was the basic policy and security assumption that led him throughout his life during the struggle for the creation of Israel as prime minister. And what it really meant was that it is a problem that can be managed, but it can't be solved. This is what we say today in modern language. And Ben-Gurion was really the inventor of that formula, which is today so common. 1919. Now, Ben-Gurion and there are many stories, by the way, that shaping his, which he very, very often repeated and told about how did he reach this conclusion. He always used two basic stories. Just in short, I tell you, one of them was a guy whom he had known as a student at the University of Istanbul, an Arab guy. And a few years later, the Turkish authorities in Palestine expelled Ben-Gurion, deported him from Palestine. And just before he has to leave, because of his Zionist activity, and just before he leaves, he meets this guy by chance, and he tells him, I'm leaving. And this Arab guy of him, this Arab friend of his tells him, as your friend, I'm very sorry for you. As an Arab, I'm very, very happy. And this is something which Ben-Gurion immediately afterwards wrote to his father. 1,000 times he repeated that story. But it is something. And there was also a conversation with Musa Alami, who was a prominent Palestinian lawyer in Palestine. Ben-Gurion tried to, this is later, Ben-Gurion tried to convince him that Zionism is good for everybody. Zionism will develop the country, and Jews and Arabs alike will profit from it. And Musa Alami told him, as far as I'm concerned, this country can be desolate for 100 years if it's only to be us who develop it and not you. 1,000 times Ben-Gurion repeated that story also. Now, Ben-Gurion and 1948 is a big subject. As you know, Israel won the War of Independence of 1948. Ben-Gurion was the commander-in-chief of Israel's War of Independence, as we call it, the Nakba, as the Arabs call it. And the price was for that war was quite high. About 6,000 Israelis, 1% of the entire population was killed. One of them, by the way, was my father. And when the war ended, very few of the 700,000 Arabs who had lived here before were left in Israel, remained in Israel. Their towns and villages remained empty. Now, the Arabs left, the Arabs escaped, the Arabs were forced to escape, and the Arabs were driven out. And in my book, I use all these terms purposefully because they are all true. Not what happened in one place, not everything that happened in one place happened the same way everywhere else, and not what happened in one point in time happened the same way. So it's a kind of complicated story. It's a story in debate. As you know, it is still debated it's in the center of the Arab-Israeli conflict. There is, however, one thing which is not in debate, and that is that Israel did not let them come back. There are very clear and open decisions about that. And in that sense, Israel bears at least part of the responsibility for the perpetuation of the problem. And I regret that we have not yet recognized our part in the Palestinian tragedy.
Okay, we will start the conversation with you. As always, if there are any students who have a question, I would like to start with them. Yes.
Josh, introduce yourself and your role at the center.
Okay. Hi, I'm Josh. I'm a sophomore here at the SIS, and I guess my role at the center would be as a co-editor-in-chief of Student is Reality, which is a student-run blog about all things Israel. First of all, thank you for coming to speak. My question would be: you spoke early on about Ben-Gurion's I don't know if admiration is the right word, of Lenin's leadership and his commitment to values and his iron will when it came to those values. And we all know that he accepted a partition plan in '47 that was not fully the land that maybe he was expecting, and you also mentioned he wanted to maximize land in the potential state. So could you speak to compromises that Ben-Gurion did make when the time came? Thank you.
Ben-Gurion read the full text of the so-called Peel Plan, the plan which the British suggested in 1937 to divide the country, partition the country in two states. He read it one day in the morning and was not happy with it. And the same evening he read it again and came across the fact that the British were actually suggesting to move out the Palestinian population, the Arab population, from the section which was designated to the Jewish state. In other words, the Jews will receive part of the land, but it will be basically empty from Arabs. And from that point on, that is something which made Ben-Gurion very enthusiastic. In his diary, he writes the words, forced transfer kafui, and underlines it. And from that point on, Ben-Gurion was openly identified with the idea of a population transfer, of moving the Arabs out of that part of Palestine which eventually be an independent Jewish state. Not necessarily by force, but he contemplates all kinds of ideas. But this is the major idea that came to him concerning the future of the relations. The Arabs must be gone from that part of the land which will be ours.
Based maybe also on other examples, like India and Pakistan and other
Not
examples.
India and Pakistan so much as Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey, this is something which he constantly repeats. He also believed in perhaps buy some Arab consent for money, a lot of money, from Iraq, for example, moving the Arabs out of Iraq. But the country has to be, there has to be a very solid Jewish majority, and maximum small Jewish minority can remain. And this is 1937. And so if he in 1919 determined that part of the price for an independent state will be life without peace, in 1937 he is actually talking about a Palestinian tragedy, which he felt would be inevitable. He very clearly determined that in 1948 Israel will not occupy the West Bank, not occupy Gaza, and not occupy East Jerusalem. This is somehow connected to his. He said, "Okay, so we won't have the Wailing Wall for a while," and because these territories were by now populated by hundreds and thousands of refugees, so we've just gotten rid of them. Makes no sense to reoccupy. While he was prime minister, he repeatedly discussed and thought of, maybe considered the occupation of the West Bank, and decided against it. And only for a very short period of time, Israel occupied Gaza and immediately gave it back during the Sinai campaign of '56, and immediately and at the eve of the Six-Day War, he was against Israel opening war against Egypt for two reasons. A, he thought the Israeli army is not ready. He was very much afraid that the Egyptians may bomb Tel Aviv and the atomic reactor in Dimona. But he also felt that this might lead to the occupation of the West Bank. And this is something which, so for Ben-Gurion, when you say land or part of the land empty, or all of the land populated with Arabs, he prefers, this is a very, very clear thing, and this is what happened in '67 is a clear deviation from Ben-Gurion's idea. Ben-Gurion was already quite old at that time. At the beginning, he was very strongly advocated compromise with Jordan and Egypt. His formulation was, if I have to choose between large Israel without peace or a small Israel with peace, I prefer small Israel with peace. He told us this very same sentence, and we were there, and not for the first time. We thought that we heard it for the first time, but he had said it before. And this was almost the first thing I did as a journalist, so I was so little experienced that it didn't occur to me to ask him, Mr. Ben-Gurion, and what about Jerusalem? We didn't ask that. I didn't ask that. So to the present time, I always say this is the biggest mistake I did is in over 50 years of journalism. Okay, and he would have said, no, there's nothing to talk about. We don't talk about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is ours. So peace, yes, but not Jerusalem. And he then really became the major advocate of annexing Jerusalem and populating Jerusalem with Jews. This is also interesting. Again, I'm telling you this as a biographer. There is a personal aspect here. Ben-Gurion had to defend himself as prime minister, to defend himself constantly for not having taken the old city in '48. Especially Begin constantly attacked him. You gave it to the Arabs, Jerusalem the Holy. And what happened now is that his biggest political enemy, Levi Eshkol, is the one who did take Jerusalem. So this is difficult for a person to live with, and so he made himself the big advocate of the annexation, the unification of Jerusalem. And one thing which he said, not in our conversation, but later, was that Israel should immediately tear down the walls of the old city. And when asked, at the beginning, everybody thought that this is just one of those things which he said sometimes. He could be very, spontaneous if you want, or he just said some things without thinking them through, let's say like this. And so everybody thought this is one of those things, but no, he repeated it in writing. He thought that the right thing to do was to tear down the walls of the old city. They have absolutely no historical value. They have no historical, the Tower of David, as we call it, is really a Muslim minaret, and gone with it, and make Jerusalem one town. And so,
Well, good he wasn't in power then anymore.
he was not in power there anymore. Actually, Eshkol was a very decent and responsible and intelligent man, but it was very difficult to be prime minister after Ben-Gurion. In fact, I think that one reason why Eshkol and President Johnson went on so well was because they were two people who had the big shadow over their heads, and so I think that may have been a reason. Anyway, this is
Let's take a few more questions.
I'll try to be shorter now.
I should say we have to leave here, unfortunately, at 7:30, so we'll collect a few questions, and yes, I guess we need unfortunately, shorter answers. There is Professor Friedman. Where's the mic? Oh, here, yes. Here,
So Ben-Gurion was a big driving
you want
factor.
to introduce yourself?
Elon Berger, I'm a sophomore. Ben-Gurion was a big proponent of the whole alliance of the periphery and Israel's covert diplomatic relations. What would you say his biggest success in this regard is?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said. Can you repeat it? He
yeah.
was a big of what?
The alliance of the periphery and reaching out and making diplomatic relations covertly was something that Ben-Gurion was a big driving factor behind. So what do you think his biggest success diplomatically in this regard is, and what would be a relationship or an overture that he made that wasn't requited that he would have wanted to have had happen?
I think that Ben-Gurion's most important diplomatic achievement was the relationship with Germany. And this is the other thing which I praise him for, and some of my friends are angry with me for praising his relationship with the Orthodox, and the other subject, of course, which is very, very controversial still to today, and is connected with Ben-Gurion in the Holocaust. It's all very, very complicated subject. But Ben-Gurion realized that the future for Israel lies in the Western Bloc, and that was something in dispute in Israeli politics at the time, because some very strong political elements in Israel wanted Israel to belong to the communist bloc, and we know what happened to countries who chose or were forced to live under Stalin. And Ben-Gurion said, no, we belong to America, also because of the Jewish community. And his relationship with Germany was part of the decision that we are not neutral. Small countries could not remain neutral after the outbreak of the Korea War. He had a moral explanation for what he said, bad enough that the Germans took our people away. They don't also have to take our money away. They should pay. It was important economically for Israel to have the German reparations, and it is connected with Ben-Gurion's basic attitude to the Holocaust, in the sense that for Ben-Gurion the Holocaust was first and foremost not a crime against humanity and not a crime against the Jewish people, but a crime against the state of Israel, because the Germans killed those people to whom Ben-Gurion expected to come to the land of Israel and build a modern Jewish state. And that did not happen. And as a result of that, unwillingly, but without any other alternative, the Zionist movement discovered the Jews living in the Arab world. Before that, nobody paid any attention to them. They were mostly, if at all, some anthropological interest. Herzl didn't even know that they exist. And this is one of the reasons why basically Ben-Gurion was quite disappointed. These are not the people with whom he felt that he can build a modern state and the state cannot become.
Which by itself is an interesting...
This, by the way, and the Holocaust survivors. And he felt that Holocaust survivors are, rightfully, they are broken people. What can I do with them?
Let's take a couple more questions. One over there, sure. And then, Letitia, why don't you go here in the middle? Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Eliora. Thank you. I work in the DC area. My question is, what do you think David Ben-Gurion would think of Israeli society today and the relationship between the secular and the religious, the proportion of secular and religious, the relationship between Ashkenazi, Sephardi? What would you think he would think of the progress or regress of Israeli society?
I hate that question. I don't know what he would say. I know that in America, I don't know if it's still on, but there was a time when Americans liked if history at the history department. I don't know, but I think that Israel today really represents a great deal of Ben-Gurion's dream. We still have the same problems which he couldn't solve, but it definitely represents a great deal of his dream. In that sense, I can answer your question, and I also think that historically we are continuing the process which the Zionist movement started in the 1920s and the 1930s. It is the same Zionist project. And in that sense, I can also say that I think that Netanyahu, in many respects, follows in the footsteps of Ben-Gurion. And I mean this seriously, not cynically. I really think that he does, including a great deal of pragmatic realism. Every time the people in Gaza attack Israel, some of Netanyahu's cabinet ministers demand that we occupy Gaza. And for the last 13 years or so, we have not. So Netanyahu, I think, does follow in the footsteps of Ben-Gurion in many aspects.
Over here.
Hi. Working? Yeah. Adina Friedman, George Mason. So a follow-up in a way on that. So from my research and from reading some of your previous books, the discourse that Ben-Gurion employed vis-a-vis or about the Jews from Arab countries is I found it to be in most important ways similar to the discourse he employed against Palestinian Arabs or Arabs in general, and to discourse that the state employs today vis-a-vis Arabs or about Arabs. So, and that has to do with an ethnocentric or Eurocentric or whatever else. Do you see any parallels?
No, I don't think that you can compare Ben-Gurion's attitude to the Arabs to the attitude he had to Jews from Arab country. He did develop an historiosophical view, which not many people know, in that just as Jews in Europe internalized some of the European culture, and therefore they are more useful for the purposes of Zionism, in the same way, Jews in Arab countries internalized some of the primitive ways of life and ideas and values of the Oriental world. This is something which he did. But he did not compare Jews from Arab countries to the Arabs. The Arabs to Ben-Gurion were first and foremost the enemy. There's a cabinet meeting where he says, an Arab is first of all an Arab. And if you think that he will ever be a loyal citizen, you understand nothing about human nature. So it was a national conflict here. The Jews from Arab countries worried him very much, especially in terms of security, because he got reports that they are bad soldiers, that they commit more war, that they don't obey, they commit more war crimes than others, and he felt that Jews from Arab countries are not the ones who are equipped, bring the abilities which he needed for a modern state, for state building. He was aware of some similarities between Arabs and Jews from Arab countries. There's one quite astonishing moment when in a cabinet meeting he says that there is a danger that an Arab terrorist will enter a cinema and leave a bomb, and people will let him in because they think that he is a Jew from Iraq. And this is years and years, decades before such a thing ever happened anywhere. The terrorist will leave a bomb somewhere. So we did have these feelings, but there is a tendency among some Israelis to describe Ben-Gurion's attitude towards Jews from Arab countries as racism. And I've concluded that this is not an accurate description of him, because as I understand racism requires hatred. Ben-Gurion did not hate the Jews from Arab lands. He thought that they are not helpful to what he had in mind, to fulfill the original dream he had. But there is no hatred of them.
Room for one last question, Professor Zeev. And okay, we'll take both. The student, Madison, and right? Did I see your hand up? And then Professor Zeev.
Hi, as the professor already said, my name is Madison. I'm a junior in the history department. My question is that you talked a little bit about his moral beliefs later on in life. Did he have any moral regrets for the Zionism that he started and the catapulting of the different wars that it's also started as well, and those deaths that came from it, and as you said, the death of your father? Did he have any regrets of starting those things and those events?
He was not a post-Zionist. No, he had no regrets about his original ideology. As I said before, it really was the essence of his whole identity, and that never changed. What did bother him very much, and I find this extremely interesting, but I don't want to sum it up because it's really important that you read it. If you are interested, you read it the way he said it and the way he thought. He had lots and lots of thoughts about the tragedy of the Palestinians. Like he would deny to himself that it ever happened. Like he would, on the other hand, make a point of going to the empty villages to make sure that they are empty. He also saw crowds of refugees leaving places like Haifa. He wanted to see. On the other hand, he says, well, if he needed justification for it. He looked for all kinds of arguments to justify it to himself. He was aware of it. For example, he at one point says, the fact that they left means that they are not as deeply connected to the land of Israel as the Jews who stayed, which, by the way, is not true, because tens of thousands of Jews had to leave their homes. Whole settlements were evacuated because when there's shooting, people go. So it's interesting how this bothered him constantly. The numbers bothered him. He, by the way, used the higher numbers. There's today there is a controversy. Was it 500,000 or 700,000? He says 750 somewhere. And but this is something that constantly bothered him. And there's one point which I find particularly revealing in a cabinet meeting where he suddenly talks to the refugees as if they are there in the cabinet meeting. He says, "You lost the war, you are gone." Talking to them. Why why do you need that? Why do you constantly have to find justifications for obviously very tragic thing which comes back to him all the time? So I think this is quite interesting to Ben-Gurion as a person.
Let's get the last question. Guy
I'm Guy Zev, I'm a professor here at SAS. My question to you concerns domestic Israeli politics. And today, in the era of Netanyahu, the vast majority of Israelis self-identify as right-wing. You might say that this has been kind of the trend for many, many years. There's been a delegitimization against the left under Netanyahu, but he's not the only one who's done that. And so the left today is very marginalized. Back in the days of Ben-Gurion, there was, one might argue, a delegitimization against the right, or against the revisionist Zionist right. And I'd be interested in kind of a comparison maybe between Ben-Gurion and his successor that you mentioned earlier, Eshkol, in terms of how they dealt with political rivals, because they had a dramatically different style. And I'm specifically interested in whether Eshkol's openness to the right also helped in some ways to legitimize what up until then wasn't seen as acceptable among the mainstream. So I'd be interested in your take on that.
So this is the kind of question to open evening with, not to end an evening with. But first of all, about today, the left in Israel practically doesn't exist anymore. And what they accuse each other of being leftist, but they are not really leftist. And it's interesting historically to try and analyze why did that happen. It happened, because at one point Israel gave up its social-democratic social and economic policy, and it worked. The capitalist system which we have worked. Never before did so many Israelis feel economically comfortable as they feel under Netanyahu. We have hardly no inflation, no unemployment. It works. Secondly, there is no chance for peace with the Arabs. So you can talk peace until tomorrow morning as a leftist, but it doesn't lead anywhere. And so what we have today is a kind of what you call a standstill between two major parties who are not that different from each other. The Likud and the blue-white party, they are not so different from each other. They are central right, very much in accordance with what also happens in Europe. Many democracies are becoming right-wing, and Israel has become increasingly right-wing, and a large number of voters for blue-white are right-wing. And what happens today in Israel is really very much a personal problem. The problem is called Netanyahu. If he wasn't there, or if he for some reason says, okay, I'm resigning, you have a government within 5 minutes. So that's a real personal problem. And it's very interesting for people who are interested in the weaknesses of democracy. This is the classical thing where democracy doesn't have an answer. It's the same figures. So we don't know how to form a government. And I don't know what will happen. It's really about a very small number of candidates. Each one needs about 2 or 3 or 4. In former days, you could buy them. Like you would say, okay, you will be a vice minister of something and get a Volvo with a driver. But for some reason, until now, this hasn't happened. Maybe the price is higher today than it used to be. It doesn't go with the Volvo anymore. But the story of Eshkol is really, really interesting, because he had the courage to introduce a very, very different policy from that of Ben-Gurion in style. Not not ideologically, but Menachem Begin, by the way, Begin and Ben-Gurion used to compare each other to Hitler. But all the time in writing. There's one letter of Ben-Gurion where you really think he completely lost his mind, where he makes the argument that Begin is another Hitler. But for Eshkol, no, Eshkol talks with everybody, looks for compromises, and does several things which Ben-Gurion, for no rational reason, refused to do in terms of relationship with the opposition. Eshkol would never compare anybody to Hitler. So it's very much a matter of mentality, of different style, and Eshkol believed in a different way of politics, much healthier, by the way. And it took really the hour of almost destruction, almost a second Holocaust, for Ben-Gurion to talk with Begin. And Begin comes to him at the eve of the Six-Day War and asks him to return to government. Also difficult for Begin, because Begin to go to Ben-Gurion. But this really needed now. Eshkol, I think that the way Eshkol dealt with the opposition is the proper democratic way to deal with the opposition. As they say in England, His Majesty's loyal opposition. Okay, so this is very much a matter of style and more democracy. Ben-Gurion was not a democratic leader. So
that's a statement.
He was committed to basic values of liberalism and American system of government and British system of government. But as long as he feels that it fits the purposes of the needs of the country. If it doesn't, then he takes a whole population and of Israeli Arabs, and for 20 years they lived under military restrictions, all completely arbitrary and corrupt system to prevent freedom of movement to Israeli Arabs. Why? Because he thinks that the Arab is an enemy, including Israeli Arabs. So he's a limited. Everything is the state comes first to everything in Ben-Gurion, and I think that that was not the case with Eshkol. And it's interesting how completely, almost madly, Ben-Gurion hated Eshkol at the end. Again, just one concluding sentence as a biographer. It's very tragic, but some people live too long, and Ben-Gurion lived 10 years too long. The last 10 years of Ben-Gurion are very, very sad and tragic, and tarnish his historical reputation.
Well, it's a sad ending, but it's an ending.